The old logging road. A group of friends set out on a road trip to the mountains for a weekend of hiking and camping. Their GPS indicated a route through some scenic forest roads, which they eagerly followed. But when the GPS rerouted to avoid a detour ahead, they found themselves on a narrow, unpaved logging road, hemmed in by towering trees. They lost cell service miles back. After half an hour of slow, bumpy driving with no end in sight, they noticed something strange. They kept passing the same clearing. Thinking they were just driving in circles, they tried to retrace their route, but every path somehow led them back to that same eerie, empty clearing. By dusk, the friends were truly scared. The road looked different in the dim light, twisting in directions that made no sense. They felt watched, though they never saw anyone around. Finally, they stopped in the clearing, hoping for the GPS to catch a signal, when they noticed something chilling. Scattered around the edge of the clearing were personal belongings, torn backpacks, rusted tools, and even a broken phone with an old, yellowed screen. Realizing this wasn't just an old logging road, they bolted into the car. Just as they sped away, a figure emerged from the woods. One friend in the back seat swore they saw him smiling, holding something, a piece of torn fabric, in the same color as one of their friend's jackets. To this day, they can't shake the feeling they narrowly escaped whatever fate awaited them on that forest road. The abandoned town. Two college students decided to take a shortcut through backroads during a road trip. They ended up driving through a small, forgotten town that wasn't on any map. It was eerie, houses with boarded-up windows, a diner with shattered glass, and an old church looming at the center of it all. Something felt off, but they kept driving, hoping to get back to the main highway. When they finally spotted a gas station on the edge of town, relief washed over them. But as they pulled in, the lights flickered and went out. It was deserted, of course, but there was a payphone near the pump. Desperate for directions, one of them picked up the receiver, and was startled to hear the faint hum of a dial tone. Tentatively, he dialed a number, his parents' number, hoping maybe the payphone was somehow functional. But after a few rings, he heard a voice, not his parents'. Instead, a woman with a hollow, emotionless tone said, "Oh, you're back. You've come home." The friend slammed down the receiver and they sprinted to the car. They sped out of town, but after 10 minutes, they realized they were back at the gas station. Panicked, they tried again, taking random turns, but every road curved back to that airy little town. The entire night was a blur of fear and confusion as they kept seeing the gas station, the same boarded-up houses, even the same ominous church. At dawn, they finally found themselves back on the main road, exhausted and trembling. They both remember the woman's voice, chilling and distant. But the strangest part? When they checked their phone records later, that payphone call had lasted exactly 13 minutes. The hospital basement. As a paramedic, Sarah had grown used to strange hours, long shifts, and the occasional odd occurrence. But one night, after bringing in a patient to a small rural hospital, she made a wrong turn while heading back to the ambulance bay. Somehow, she found herself in a basement corridor she didn't recognize. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting the hall in a sickly yellow glow. It was cold, colder than any hospital corridor should have been. She shivered and checked her watch. She was already late getting back, but the corridor kept turning, twisting, seeming to stretch longer and longer. Suddenly, she heard faint voices, a muffled conversation. Thinking it was the maintenance staff, she followed the sound, but as she turned a corner, she froze. A group of people stood in the hallway, backs to her, dressed in old-fashioned hospital uniforms, completely motionless. Sarah felt her heart race as she called out, but no one responded. Their heads turned in unison, just slightly, and she saw their faces, blank, pale, with hollow, staring eyes. She blinked, and they were gone. Rushing back, Sarah finally found the exit door and stumbled into the ambulance bay. She never spoke of the basement again, but later learned the hospital was built over an old asylum site, one that had a long history of mysterious deaths. Now, she always takes the long way around the corridors, avoiding every turn that might lead her back there. The lake house driveway. On a family vacation to a rented lake house, a man named Greg arrived late after a long day's drive. The area was remote, with dense woods around and no streetlights. He mistakenly drove a bit too far past the driveway, finding himself on a narrow dirt road. He tried to turn back, but the road twisted and climbed, heading deeper into the woods instead of back to the main road. After 10 minutes, he finally came to a small clearing where he could turn around. But just as he was about to back out, his headlights caught sight of something among the trees, what looked like several wooden crosses, weathered with age, scattered around the ground. Before he could make sense of it, his car stalled. He turned the ignition over and over, cursing as the engine spluttered. Then, through his windshield, he noticed figures standing in the shadows, staring at him. They were motionless, just beyond the beam of his headlights, half obscured by the trees. Greg's breath hitched as he fumbled to start the engine. When it finally roared to life, he reversed and sped down the dirt road. As he left, his rear-view mirror showed the figures moving toward the center of the road, watching him leave, their faces still hidden in shadow. When he finally reached the lake house, Greg was pale, shaken, and never mentioned what he'd seen to his family. But the next day, as they explored the property, his wife found an old, splintered wooden cross leaning against the side of the lake house. The tunnel underpass. A young couple, Nate and Lily, were driving through the countryside late at night, heading to a family cabin they'd rented for the weekend. They were new to the area and relied entirely on their GPS to guide them. As they drove, the GPS suddenly directed them to take a sharp right turn down a barely visible side road, saying it would recalculate for a faster route. They reluctantly followed, finding themselves on an unmarked gravel path that twisted into a dark forest. After a few miles, they approached a narrow, abandoned underpass tunnel. The inside of the tunnel was pitch black, and the headlights barely cut through the thick darkness. The air was still, too still, and it felt wrong. They debated turning back, but the GPS insisted they continue. As they slowly entered the tunnel, they noticed the walls were covered in symbols and strange, smeared handprints. Just as they reached the middle of the tunnel, the car shuddered, and the headlights flickered. The lights came back on, and Nate screamed. Just outside the car window were faces, pale, empty-eyed faces, pressed against the glass, staring at them without blinking. They were everywhere, hundreds of ghostly figures shrouded in darkness, pressed up against the car like they'd been waiting for them. Panicked, Nate floored the gas, and the car screeched as it surged forward. But the faces seemed to follow, even as they sped out of the tunnel. Once they were safely back on the main road, Lily turned around in her seat to see if they were gone. They were. But every morning since, the couple has found strange handprints on the outside of their car, as if something from that tunnel is still following them. The lonely gas station. Daniel was driving home after a long shift at work. He had 2 hours to go and decided to take a quicker route through some remote highways to save time. Around midnight, he realized he was running low on gas. Spotting a sign for a gas station a few miles ahead, he sighed with relief and took the exit. The gas station looked strange, old, run down, and completely empty. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting a sickly glow over the lot. Daniel pulled up to a pump and got out, but the pump didn't turn on. He went to the small convenience store attached to the station, hoping to find an attendant, but the door was locked. Just as he turned to leave, he noticed something odd, a figure, standing inside the store, staring at him from the other side of the glass. The figure wore an old-fashioned uniform, and its face was half covered by shadow. But what unsettled Daniel the most was the way the figure's head was tilted, just slightly, as if studying him. Then, almost in slow motion, the figure raised a hand and waved. The wave was eerie, slow, as if beckoning him inside. Daniel bolted back to his car and sped out of there, deciding he'd rather risk running out of gas than stay another second. As he pulled back onto the road, he glanced in his rearview mirror. In the distance, he saw the figure step out of the gas station, watching his car as he drove away. He didn't stop driving until he reached his front door, and he never took that shortcut again. The Forgotten Asylum. Years ago, a group of friends went out for a late-night joyride, looking for some adventure. They'd heard rumors about an old asylum, abandoned decades ago after a mysterious fire, and decided to check it out. The asylum was deep in the woods, but they eventually found an old, crumbling road that seemed to lead there. As they drove closer, the road became increasingly overgrown, almost as if nature itself was trying to keep them out. Eventually, they saw it, a sprawling, decayed building looming in the shadows, its broken windows staring back at them like hollow eyes. They got out, and one of the friends dared the others to go inside. But as they approached, a strange sound filled the air, a low, almost rhythmic hum. It seemed to come from everywhere, echoing through the trees and the cracked walls of the asylum. The air felt heavy, thick with something they couldn't explain. Then they saw movement in one of the windows, a flash of white, like a face staring back at them. Spooked, they quickly ran back to the car, but just as they started to drive away, the headlights caught sight of something strange on the side of the road. There were figures standing in the trees, watching them leave. They looked like patients, gaunt, clad in tattered hospital gowns, their faces blank and pale. The friends sped off, but the eerie sound lingered, fading only after they were miles away. Years later, one of them returned to that road out of curiosity. But the asylum was gone, and there was no trace of it on any map. To this day, they wonder if it was real, or if they'd somehow wandered into a place that existed in another time, another dimension. The shortcut through the fields. Laura was driving through a rural area late at night, trying to reach her grandmother's house. Her GPS suggested a shortcut that would cut through a series of farmlands. It was unfamiliar, but she took the turn anyway, hoping it would get her there faster. The dirt road was narrow, lined with cornfields that stretched on endlessly into the dark. Every now and then, her headlights would catch movement in the fields, shadows of something darting through the tall stalks. She told herself it was just the wind or animals, but an unsettling feeling crept over her. After several miles, she saw something strange by the roadside, a row of old, worn scarecrows, each with a different expression sewn onto its face. Some looked angry, others terrified, and one had a wide, toothy grin that looked far too human. Shaken, she sped up, but soon realized the road didn't seem to end. It just kept going, winding endlessly through more fields and more scarecrows. Finally, she saw someone on the road, a figure standing completely still, watching her approach. She slowed down, and the figure moved. It was an old man with empty eyes and a strange smile, and he held a hand out as if asking her to stop. Panicked, she swerved around him, not daring to look back. After what felt like an eternity, the dirt road finally led back to the highway. She looked in her rear-view mirror as she turned onto the main road. Standing at the edge of the field, illuminated by her brake lights, was the old man, smiling that strange, empty smile as he watched her drive away. The deserted motel. A young traveler named Eric was driving cross-country on the deserted highway late one night when he noticed his gas gauge dipping dangerously low. Just as he started to worry, he spotted a sign for a nearby motel and gas station a few miles down a side road. Relieved, he followed the signs, but the road seemed to stretch endlessly through barren fields. Finally, he arrived at the motel, a dilapidated building with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. The gas station next door was dark and closed, so Eric decided to check into the motel for the night and refuel in the morning. The lobby was empty, but the bell at the counter summoned an old woman with a strange, fixed smile. She handed him a room key without saying much, and he quickly made his way to his room. Once inside, Eric was struck by an odd feeling that something was wrong. The wallpaper was peeling, and there were strange stains on the carpet, but he chalked it up to the motel's age. He closed the door, double-locked it, and got ready for bed. But just as he lay down, he heard a faint scratching sound coming from the other side of the wall. Thinking it was a rodent or a pipe issue, he tried to ignore it, but the scratching grew louder, more insistent. Then, he heard faint whispers, like voices murmuring in low tones, coming from just outside his door. Cautiously, he peered through the peephole and saw a group of shadowy figures standing in the hallway, staring at his door. Panicked, Eric decided to leave, but as he opened the door, the hallway was empty. He quickly packed up and ran back to his car, only to find the gas tank reading full. Confused but not willing to stay any longer, he sped off, watching the motel fade in his rearview mirror. The next morning, he stopped at a diner and told the waitress about the strange experience. Her face paled as she listened, and she told him that motel had burned down years ago, along with everyone inside. The foggy coastal road. Jessie was driving along a coastal road on a foggy night, making her way to a friend's beach house. Her GPS lost signal, and the dense fog made it nearly impossible to see the road signs, but she continued on, trusting her instincts. Eventually, she came across a narrow, winding road with a sign that read Old Shore Road. Thinking it might be a shortcut, she took it, but the road twisted and turned, growing narrower and more uneven. Soon, her headlights revealed something strange, a line of cars, each parked along the shoulder, their windows fogged up from the inside. Curiosity got the better of her, and she pulled over to investigate. She stepped out, but as she approached the nearest car, she noticed there was someone sitting in the driver's seat, head resting on the steering wheel. She tapped on the window, but there was no response. She moved to the next car, and the next, all the same, with people sitting motionless inside, faces obscured. She backed away, her heart pounding, and quickly got back in her own car. But when she tried to turn around, she found her tires spinning in the gravel, unable to move. Suddenly, her headlights flickered, and she caught a glimpse of someone standing in the fog just beyond her car, staring at her with empty, hollow eyes. The headlights went out completely. She screamed, fumbling to start the car again. When the lights finally came back on, the figure was gone, but the road ahead was blocked by more motionless cars, each with a shadowy figure inside. Somehow, she managed to reverse all the way back to the main road and didn't stop driving until she was miles away, vowing never to take that road again. The cemetery shortcut. One night, a young man named Tom decided to take a shortcut through a winding country road that passed an old, sprawling cemetery. He'd driven the route dozens of times in the daylight, but tonight it felt different. The air was colder, and a heavy fog clung to the ground, obscuring everything around him. As he made his way through the fog, he saw a shadow dart across the road up ahead. He slowed down, scanning the area, but saw nothing except rows of gravestones stretching into the mist. Trying to shake off the unease, he kept driving, but soon he spotted someone standing by the roadside, a woman in a long, flowing dress, her back to him. Thinking she might need help, he slowed down and rolled down his window, calling out to her. She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned to face him, revealing a face that looked hollow, eyes that were black voids. Tom floored the gas, speeding out of the cemetery road, his heart racing. But just as he thought he'd made it out, he glanced in his rearview mirror, and there she was, sitting in his back seat, smiling that empty smile, her dark eyes fixed on him. He swerved off the road in panic, crashing into a ditch. When he came to, paramedics were pulling him out of the car, but when he asked about the woman, they looked at him in confusion. There was no one else in the car. The mountain path. While on a camping trip in the mountains, a man named Leo decided to take a short hike to catch the sunrise from a peak nearby. He had mapped out a trail, but in the dim pre-dawn light, he took a wrong turn and ended up on an unfamiliar path that wound deeper into the woods. As he walked, the trees grew denser, and the air turned unnaturally cold. After a while, he realized he wasn't alone. Faint footsteps echoed behind him, keeping pace but never coming closer. He called out, but there was no response, only silence and the eerie sound of those unseen steps following him. Desperate to find his way back, he picked up his pace, but the path only twisted further into the woods. Then he saw it, an old, abandoned cabin sitting in a clearing. Smoke drifted from the chimney, as if someone was inside. He cautiously approached, hoping to ask for directions, but as he got closer, he saw that the cabin was decayed, windows broken, with no sign of life. Just as he turned to leave, he heard a voice, faint and echoing, calling his name from inside the cabin. He froze, heart pounding, recognizing it as his own voice calling back to him. Terrified, he ran back the way he came, never looking back. When he finally stumbled onto the main trail hours later, exhausted and shaken, he told his friends what had happened. They warned him never to go near that path again, saying it was known as Echo Way, a place where people went missing, leaving only faint echoes of themselves behind. The Mirror Maze. Mara was on a road trip when she took a wrong exit, winding up in a small town she'd never heard of. Curious, she decided to explore, eventually coming across an old carnival that looked like it hadn't been open in years. She walked around, admiring the dusty rides, when she noticed an entrance to a mirror maze, its neon sign flickering faintly. Feeling adventurous, she stepped inside. The maze was eerie, filled with tall mirrors that reflected her in distorted, unsettling ways. She walked deeper, turning corners, but somehow kept seeing reflections that didn't quite match her movements, as if someone else was moving within the glass. As she wandered, she began to feel trapped, turning corner after corner only to find herself staring back at an endless series of her own reflections. Just as she started to panic, she noticed something horrifying. One of her reflections wasn't her. It looked like her, but the eyes were wrong, too dark, and the smile was twisted, sinister. The reflection stepped forward, reaching its hand toward the glass, as if trying to pull itself out. Terrified, she turned to run, but every exit led her deeper into the maze. Finally, she stumbled out, shaken and disoriented, only to find herself back where she'd started, in the middle of the empty parking lot, staring at the entrance to the mirror maze, as if she'd never gone in at all. She drove away immediately, but when she looked in her rear-view mirror, she saw her own face, smiling back in that same twisted way she'd seen in the maze. The road to nowhere. One rainy night, Alex was driving home from a business trip, exhausted and eager to reach his bed. His GPS suggested a shortcut through a series of narrow back roads he didn't recognize, but trusting the technology, he took the turn. As he drove, the rain intensified, and a thick mist began to cover the road. The path grew narrower and rougher, and Alex realized he hadn't seen another car or house in miles. His GPS seemed to glitch, rerouting him back to the same spot repeatedly. Frustrated, he tried to turn around, but as he looked over his shoulder, he saw something strange, a row of figures in the distance, all standing still by the side of the road. As he drove closer, he saw that they were people, all dressed in clothes from different eras, a man in an old suit and hat, a woman in a long, torn dress, a child clutching a stuffed bear, all staring blankly at his car with empty eyes. Their faces were pale, almost translucent in the fog, and they didn't move as he passed. Terrified, Alex kept driving, hoping to find the main road again, but every turn brought him back to the same spot with those silent figures watching him. Finally, as dawn began to break, he saw a highway sign and managed to escape. He still doesn't know if those figures were real, but he avoids back roads now, unwilling to risk meeting them again. The Phantom Train Station. While on vacation, Jamie missed the last bus and had to walk back to her hotel alone. She noticed a set of train tracks nearby, and further down the path, a small, abandoned train station. She was intrigued, but when she got closer, she noticed it didn't look entirely deserted. Dim lights flickered on the platform, casting strange shadows over the walls. Curious, she walked onto the platform and noticed something strange, a faint sound, like an old steam engine chugging in the distance. Then she saw a train, dark and silent, slowly pulling into the station. It was unlike any train she'd ever seen, with weathered wooden carriages and dark, foggy windows. The doors slid open, and she heard faint whispers coming from inside, as if inviting her in. She took a step closer, peering into the darkness. She could make out figures sitting inside, barely visible in the dim light, all staring straight ahead. Then she realized, they weren't moving. They were all frozen, like mannequins, with faces that looked painted on, yet hauntingly lifelike. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she backed away. The train doors closed suddenly, and with a creak, it began to pull away, disappearing into the mist. She ran back to her hotel, her heart racing. When she asked the locals about it, they told her about a train that had crashed on that line decades ago, killing everyone on board. Some say it still makes its rounds, picking up new passengers who will never leave.